It is my greatest pleasure to be chairing this panel on democracy in deeply polarized societies, as I believe this is a very timely issue. And today we have three really wonderful speakers, and we will start with Anna Wojciuk, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Warsaw. She's a member of the governing board of the European International Studies Association, treasurer of the International Political Sociology section of International Studies Association, and vice president of Warsaw branch of the Polish International Studies Association. Professor Wojciuk has received many grants, and unfortunately I cannot list them here today, but she was also a Fernand Braudel Fellow at the EY in Florence, a visiting fellow at Harvard University, and a visiting scholar at Columbia University in New York, and many other places. Professor Wojciuk's research interests include theory of international relations, educational policies and their international dimensions, international security, political theory, multi-level governance, and decentralization. Then we're going to move to Maciej Kisielowski, who is an associate professor in the Department of Economics and Business at the Central European University, now in Vienna. Kisielowski's interests include application of innovation strategy to various non-market fields, including public law and regulation. Professor Kisielowski received his doctorate in law and master in law degrees from Yale Law School, MPA in economics, and public policy from Princeton University Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Maciej Kisielowski authored and edited many books, including Administrategy, which was translated into 5 languages. And his recent academic articles appeared in Law and Social Inquiry and International Business Review. And last but not least, it's my colleague, a fellow, CES fellow this year, Marek Naczyk. Marek Naczyk is an associate professor of comparative social policy at the University of Oxford. This academic year, as I said, he's a visiting scholar at the CES. Marek's research focus is on political economy of pension financialization in the OECD countries and on the politics of economic patriotism and developmentalism in Central and Eastern Europe. A recent paper of Marek entitled Taking Back Control was published in Review of International Political Economy, and the article focused on the role played by elite bankers in initiating the so-called repolonization of the Polish banking sector after the global financial crisis of 2008, and in institutionalizing greater state interventionism in the Polish economy through institutions such as the Polish Investments for Development and the Polish Development Fund. So thank you so much for agreeing to coming here today, and I would like to give the floor to Anna Wojciuk.
Thank you for your kind invitation to discuss polarization in Poland and how to deal with it. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. I will be talking about our book. This book, the name is Umówmy się na Polskę. Let's agree on Poland. And the idea of this book comes from 2017, when, together with Maciej Kisielowski, we were discussing this problem which Karolina Wigura was mentioning during a Q&A session. This was the moment of the very aggressive attack of law and justice of Polish democratic institutions. And we thought, well, if one day we have an opportunity to re-establish democracy in Poland, how should it be done? Because differently to the speakers in a previous panel, we thought it will not be possible to restore the system we had in 2015 for a couple of reasons. But one of them is the fact that law and justice and the Polish conservative side, from the beginning of the Polish constitution, from 1997, did not fully recognize this constitution. And later I will show you when I will discuss Polish polarization. This is one problem. The second problem is that actually Polish democratic institutions designed in the constitution were not designed in a way which would predict that there's going to be an actor who would openly question democratic system in Poland and who will question those institutions. And they were not well prepared for what was happening. And even in a comparative perspective with other countries which went through this type of authoritarian populism, relatively, Polish institutions were very easily captured. So we thought that if one day we have an opportunity to re-establish democracy in Poland, those institutions should be stronger, should be more resistant to a potential authoritarian actor in the system. And the third problem we were thinking about was how to address this very deep diversity which exists in a Polish society. And we thought that the constitution from 1997 did not address this diversity well enough, which then produced serious problems. And I will get to those details later on. So this book is the effect of more than 6 years of work. And after this encounter, we decided to found an association to which we invited Polish public intellectuals, business people, scholars. And what was very important for us, we believe that we have to invite people who would be genuinely from different sides of Polish political conflict. That's why we have people who are really from the conservative side, who self-identify with law and justice. And we have, of course, the liberal, the center, and the left. So all the parties which are represented in the Polish political system, we have in our association people who can be associated as public intellectuals connected to those political forces. And this book is authored by 28 people who reflect this diversity. So let's see Polish polarization, and let's acknowledge that this fact is not a new one. It didn't come with law and justice. It's deeply embedded in Polish society, and I think it speaks to what Karolina Wigura said, that from at least 17th century we have more conservative and more progressive Poland, and this is incredibly durable. So here you can see the scale of intensity of this polarization, and let's go in a journey of Polish elections. This is 1993. The red side is the conservative side, and the blue side is the progressive side. So these are parties which are associated with more progressive agenda, more pro-European, more liberal or left, and the blue ones and the red ones are conservative, more Eurosceptical types of parties. This is 1993, and you can see in 1997, there was a very important referendum. This was a referendum about Polish constitution. And you can see that this referendum actually did not overcome political polarization in Poland. Unfortunately, Polish constitution never got support of the conservative Poland. And we think that if we discuss institutions and democracy seriously, even though this is the truth liberals do not like to hear, actually the Polish democratic system, the one designed in the constitution, was from the very beginning contested by the right. The part of the problem was that in this particular parliament, which voted for this constitution, due to change of the electoral system, the right was not represented. So actually the social contract under which Poland functions from the beginning practically excluded the right. Here you can see 1997 elections, 2001, 2005, 2007, 2011, 2015. So this is the moment when Law and Justice took control over the country. This is 2019, and here you can see 2023. So nothing essentially changes, and you can, of course, the polarization is getting more intense, less intense. Of course, it's fluctuating. Also, taking the international context. Now is the time of polarization. So also in Poland, it's producing different types of mobilization, but those deep values, deep differences about what is the idea of good life are very strongly embedded in the Polish society. And the challenge is that current Polish constitution is not managing well this diversity, because even though we have local governments, a lot of policy decisions which are deeply penetrating to the private lives of people are taken in Warsaw, which leaves a lot of people deeply dissatisfied with whatever policy is proposed. It's very hard to provide centrally solutions which will make this kind of diverse group of people happy. And what's more, the system, even though it's a proportional system, so it should theoretically not generate this type of outcome. In fact, it is producing, because of the threshold and because of the don't system, it is producing the situation of winner takes all. So the side which in a given election wins, it has very strong incentives to capture the entirety of state and to change all the policies in a manner which will reflect the values of the side of the society which elected that force, leaving the other side deeply unhappy and very strongly mobilizing them against the incumbent. So when we were discussing this idea in 2017, we thought that the major challenge for the future, if one day we have this opportunity to restore democracy in Poland, would be to have a constitutional solution which would truly get approval of the conservative side of Poland. Maybe not all of them, but you need to get a part of the conservative Poland on board in order to have a consolidated democracy. You cannot have a stable democracy with an actor in the system which gets 1/3 of the votes, which is not only contesting policies, but it's contesting the system itself. And so this was the challenge we wanted to address in our project. And that's why we invited also conservative fellows to join this endeavor, and we came without any initial assumptions other than the ones I already spoke about. We came up with set of institutional solutions, because we deeply agree with Professor Markowski that Poland is too much mobilization, too little institutional thinking. So we thought, yes, we need smart institutions which will give space to this diversity which exists in Poland, which could be accepted by the conservative side, and which would be fair, so that the institutions would not themselves decide who would win the game. Yes, that this will be fair rules of the game, and that we thought that it's necessary to stop this game of conquest of the country in which the liberal side believes that it will actually enlighten the conservatives, because the liberal side failed to enlighten the conservative side during the times of the end of history, and now the end of history is finished, yes, so now it will be even more difficult. But on the other hand, the conservatives, they believe that if they win, they will convert the liberal, the progressive Poland into conservative values. And in the last 8 years, they used all the means the Polish state offered in order to do it, and they failed. Yes, so we propose a third way. So let's agree that we are not going to enlighten the other half of Poland. Let's agree that we are not going to convert the other part of Poland. Let's acknowledge that we are as we are, and that those differences are very deep, as Professor Wigura said previously. So this is our proposal, and Maciej, now the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks, Anna, for setting the stage. So I'm not going to describe the entire 400-page book in 10 or 12 minutes, but I want to give you a spirit. So first of all, what Anna has already mentioned should be very clear, that the goals which were sometimes implicitly, but in case of Radosław, Professor Markowski, very explicitly mentioned, which is to basically, well, in some ways destroy the conservative side, and the Catholic Church was mentioned by Professor Markowski explicitly, is not our goal. So compared to the previous panel, the goal of the exercise of this group of scholars and of this project is not the same as the goals that were implicitly and explicitly outlined before. Our goal is to create a situation, not a situation in which the liberal progressive side will constantly win, or that where the red side in our color convention would disappear. But our goal is to create a situation in which the system can accommodate a truly conservative government without that is not going to basically destroy the country and make it authoritarian. So this is the goal of the project. Why do you think decentralization, power sharing is, an important way to do it? Well, partly because of what Anna showed. There is a strong geographical dimension, which in the United States, of this polarization. It is persistent. But also, this is, when we have two visions of good life, they mostly come in a package, yes? And when we have a winner-takes-all system, there are only two packages, yes? We need to everybody who is liberal needed to more or less follow Donald Tusk, and everybody who is conservative needed to more or less follow Jarosław Kaczyński. If you have a system in which power is shared with, let's say, the 16 provinces in Poland called voivodeships in the English translation of the traditional Polish word, you don't have two Polands. You have 16 Polands, because as you saw, there are many shades of conservatism and progressivism, yes, and that itself lowers the polarization. Now, the third argument is simply the comparative argument. If you think about the kind of political dimension of centralization, not how much stuff the local or subnational governments do, but how much decision-making powers they have, my argument would be that Poland, along France, is still the most politically centralized large, mid-sized to large country in Europe. Some countries are decentralized symmetrically, some asymmetrically. We are very strongly for the first option, the second option we don't like. But it is natural to think about a large country like Poland looking at experiments around power sharing and democratic reforms in other large countries in the continent, where even President Macron is talking about potential decentralization, and look at this model. Now, as I said, I won't have a chance to give you a full picture, but I want to give you a taste. And the taste is exactly what Professor Makowski doesn't like, which is we love senates. We actually want to have more senates, not fewer senates. And why do we like senates? Because we are Euro enthusiasts. And we think that the European de facto functional senate, which is the Council, it is, after all, one of the effective chambers of European legislature, is a fantastic invention. It works very well to manage diversity, and it is a fantastic invention because it is structured in a very specific way. It is a legislative body made of chief executives from the lower level of governance. Why is it good? Well, let me give you very quick 5 reasons. These people are, these executive senators are responsible for results. They're not professional legislators who grandstand or can, spend time on the flowery speeches like I am trying to entertain you on this afternoon, but they need to deliver to their constituencies. They are continuous rather than term-bound, which creates the rules of mutuality, institutional memory. Yes, the prime ministers in the council and the minister in the other council change continuously. There is no break of institutional memory. They are busy. This is very important. They don't have time for this, parliamentary nonsense because they have other job to do. This is their second job, which increases the importance of experts and makes the process more rational. They are very efficient representation of the diversity. Yes, you can create many systems that represent diversity, but there is a reason why we have chief executives. Yes, they represent something important about a given unit of this diverse community that is Europe. And finally, there are 500-pound gorillas. Yes, they are really important actors who can balance the center. So when you're talking about balancing the center, power sharing, they are ideal to do it because unlike professional legislators, they have their own powers, their own money, their own legitimacy. So what we want to do is to create more European councils and EU councils in Poland. We propose in this volume to make a constitutional reform that would create the Senate made of just 16 regional governors, maybe the mayors of the largest cities. And we are also proposing that at each regional level, we also should have the Senate of the mayors to protect the cities. Because apart from this broad geographical dimension, there is also the big city versus the province dimension of our polarization. So, to conclude, what do we have? Well, our critics say often, you want to create the federal state. And it's a very peculiar Polish thing that we are so much in love with America. We are kind of in love with Germany because we fear them so much. So that's, I guess, a compliment of their power. So we are all in love with these federal states, but federalism, federalization of Poland is a slur. We say, no, we don't want to create a federalist system. We want to realize a federalist promise without federalist problem. We want to have a better Senate that you guys have here in this country with actual governors of provinces, people who actually can do something, who will vote with the vote proportional to the population they represent, just like in the European Union. We want to have the regional senates and maybe have even city-states, good examples, Berlin, Hamburg, Vienna. There is this urban-rural dimension. Why not to create city-states? Why don't you copy our example and make Houston or Austin a city-state? We want to have the strategic decentralization, sectoral, as Bruce Ackerman calls our proposal, which is very important because federalism comes with this package that like everything needs to be decentralized or nothing. We think Poland can innovate. We have a second mover advantage. Yes, why not to innovate and, for example, not have a decentralized electoral system? Let's have a unitary electoral system so that, the conservative regions cannot, like in your country, create local authoritarianism through gerrymandering. We want to have unitary judiciary. Why can't unitary judiciary with the same standards apply different laws? Possible. We want unitary law enforcement so that the regional governments will not harass people of different opinions. We want to have as few shared mandates as possible. Eliminate Ministry of Education. If you want to decentralize education, decentralize it fully. And finally, we want to fully decentralize income taxes. The proposal has been noted. The first print of this book, which is an edited volume of about constitutionalism, and is a non-fiction bestseller in Poland. So that's quite something, if nothing else. Professor Eckert wrote a very kind back cover, so as other scholars both and politicians, both domestically and internationally. And now the floor is with the new government. Yes, will they want to just enlighten, just conquer, or will they have this instinct to make history and be known as the creators of the new social contract, which can be this solution, this idea, or any other idea that will recognize this fundamental permanence of this conservative and progressive divide. Thank you so much.
Okay, so that was a very interesting set of suggestions. I'm sure there will be a lively debate afterwards. But what has struck me in your proposals, and maybe also in the previous discussion we've had, is that we very much focused on the political system. And very often we focused on socio-cultural issues and grievances that people may have and that have led to polarization. Now, if we think about the democratic state and the future of liberal democracy, we cannot separate the future of liberal democracy from the future of capitalism, right? The two systems, the capitalistic system and the democratic system, are traditionally connected to each other. So we need to actually adopt more of a political economy perspective to think about the relationship between those two. And if you took a course in Economics 101, you certainly remember your production function, and you remember that there are several factors of production. There's capital, there's labor, and in a Stiglitz-like production function, you would also think about energy. I won't think about energy and the environment right now, but I will certainly think about the relationship between capital and labor. And for liberal democracy to function, you need to have some kind of balance between capital and labor. In good old times, there was this fear that labor might become a little bit too strong and that this would lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat. We're done with that. Nowadays, the fear is actually that capital might become a little bit too strong. And if you look at polarization in various countries, you will see that sometimes actually entrepreneurs, think of Trump, think of Babiš, think of Berlusconi, have used the imbalance between capital and labor to increase polarization and to actually also gain electorally from it, paradoxically. Now, the interesting thing is that law and justice in Poland has very much politicized and problematized imbalances that have existed between capital and labor in Poland after the democratic and economic transformation of the early 90s. And that might sound a little bit paradoxical to those who are not familiar too much with the Polish context. But what Law and Justice over time has been arguing is that Polish capital as opposed to foreign capital in Poland, Polish capital has been weak, and there's a need to strengthen it. And it's developed a discourse of repolonization of the Polish economy around it. Another argument that Law and Justice has been making is that Polish labor is also weak. And it's proposed various social policies to indirectly, in some way, strengthen Polish labor. Another argument that Law and Justice has been making is that the Polish state itself and the Polish state apparatus is weak. Now, in terms of providing good proposals to repair that, it certainly hasn't done a good job, right? We know that actually it has been destroying the Polish state. But if you take away the discourse that Law and Justice has developed around those three issues, the weakness of Polish capital, the weakness of Polish labor, the weakness of the Polish state, if you take that discourse, nationalist conservative discourse away, if you even don't focus on the means that Law and Justice has been using to strengthen those three factors, but if you just think about the three aims, I mean, I find it difficult to disagree with the aims, personally at least. And I will try to show you why we should actually do those three things. And the previous opposition now, the opposition that will now be in government, in my opinion, should actually take a leaf out of Law and Justice's playbook, not the discursive leaves, not in terms of the reforms that Law and Justice has been introducing, but at least think about those aims and do a better job than Law and Justice has been doing, because that might actually, in the long term, weaken Law and Justice and weaken polarization in Poland. I will not have time to talk about some ideas that I think could be complementary actually to your proposals on how the Polish state apparatus could be strengthened. You will hear that I don't have the typical Polish accent. I actually have a very Frenchy accent. And there are two reasons for that. I was born in Brussels and raised in Brussels, and I also studied in Paris, in France, at Sciences Po. So I have very strong French thinking on how you should build a Napoleon state apparatus, and I would happily share those ideas. However, I also have my Belgian side, and the Belgian side is very much about power sharing, right, in a federal system, but also power sharing between labor and capital. And that is actually not just Belgian thinking, it's typical continental and Nordic Western European thinking. So ultimately, what I will propose is some form, Carolina, you mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville twice. You also mentioned Montesquieu. Actually, my proposal is a Tocquevillian proposal of strengthening the corps intermédiaire, pouvoir intermédiaire, the intermediate bodies, the intermediate authorities in Poland, and decentralizing some of the power by giving more power to Polish capital and Polish labor to basically regulate more of the economy, because that also might lead to less polarization. Okay, so let me focus on the first point of why we should strengthen Polish capital, business, and how we could do it. Why should we do it? Because Polish capital is capitalistically weak, and Polish capital is also organizationally weak. It's capitalistically weak. So in my niche of political science, which is called comparative political economy, it's also called the study of the varieties of capitalism, there was actually a very influential paper written by a German and a Dutch scholar, not some Central European nationalists, which pointed out that a key characteristic of the varieties of capitalism that have arisen in the Central and East European region, including in Poland, is that they are very much dependent on foreign capital. That dependence has led to immense growth and modernization of those economies. Poland was never in ruin, absolutely not. It's a champion of European growth, but it also introduces limits to that growth. It so happens that Prime Minister Morawiecki has been using this term. I don't think that that's a reason for rejecting that term, because the diagnosis, I would argue, is certainly right. So just an illustration, if you look at the share of value added that is generated by companies controlled by foreign capital as opposed to domestic capital, you have this big contrast in general between Central and Eastern European countries and West European countries, where a much larger share of value added and effectively of growth is generated by foreign controlled companies. I mean, normally you would expect that the share of, that in smaller countries, foreign multinationals would play a larger role. But if you compare Poland to larger European countries, Spain, Germany, Italy, France, you could compare it to the UK too, there's a big gap actually. And Poland effectively doesn't yet have any strong national champions. It benefits from investment from West European and other national champions. The contrast is strongest, or used to be strongest, before the repolonization of the banking sector, in the banking sector itself, which is an absolutely strategic sector for the economy because it's about control of credit and about how companies and households are financed. And none of the West European countries have given up their sovereignty in the banking sector. All Central and Eastern European countries during the economic transformation did, which leads to economic problems. And in general, where you have excessive foreign dependence on foreign capital, it also leads to political problems. Some socioeconomic implications, well, if so much of a share of value added is generated through foreign controlled companies, eventually the profits that are generated in the economy go abroad because those multinationals invest there for a reason. They invest there to make a profit, and so profits will be repatriated at the end of the day. That's during normal times. During crises, you have a risk of capital flight, which we actually saw. The risk arose during the crisis of 2008. There's a kind of lack of natural incentives for foreign investors to invest in research and development and innovation, unless they are actually pressured by the host states. And then there are also kind of more microeconomic considerations. If you actually don't have headquarters of some kinds of national champions in your country, there's some kind of glass ceiling to what managers and highly ambitious, highly educated people can achieve in your country. If strategic decisions are made abroad, there's actually a strong incentives for those people to emigrate. And emigration has also been a factor driving polarization and the rise of right-wing populism in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, some political implications. Everybody, I mean, all people following Polish politics in this room know that Law and Justice has been criticizing part of the Polish media and part of civil society for being too dependent on or directly related to foreign forces, foreign capital. Well, that also has to, and I personally don't have a problem with civil society getting some funding from, foreign sources, foreign capital, and same for the media. I don't have an issue with that personally. However, it is a weakness of the still current opposition that, to some extent, it benefits too much from those foreign sources of funding, both in terms of the media and civil society. If you strengthened, and there would be illustrations here, and I will sort of skip them. If you strengthened Polish capital, right, you could also end up having national foundations related to that Polish capital, to the Polish bourgeoisie, that could actually fund civil society, and same for the media. So I think, at least in the long run, it should be an aim to not radically reduce the extent of foreign control of the Polish economy, but at least aim to reduce the gap with large countries. It should be an aim. And there's an opportunity here, because if you actually look at how that share of foreign capital has evolved since 2015, it has actually been rising despite the repolonization discourse of Law and Justice, despite it. So if the new government, the new government should criticize Law and Justice for making Poland even more dependent on foreign capital, and there's an opportunity to do better than Law and Justice. Polish business is also organizationally weak. Those are OECD data on employer organization density in OECD countries. Poland is one of the worst pupils, I would say, from that point of view. 20% density, as opposed to much higher, 60% or even 90% sometimes in Nordic countries. And it's extremely pluralistic and divided. In most countries, you have one national umbrella organization that represents all of national business, or you maybe have two, if you have two, you have this division between an organization representing maybe larger companies and another one representing small business. In Poland, you have 6 organizations that represent Polish business in the system of social dialogue. There's already a bit of confusion when you have such divisions. And then those organizations are just not well organized because they don't also represent sectors in the economy very well. And when you actually have one single organization that represents the whole economy, usually, it always actually has member organizations that represent whole sectors, and those whole sectors are forced to come up with compromises within the larger national organization to then suggest some compromise of the business community to the government. This is definitely not happening in Poland. And this also has implications for Poland's capacity to influence decisions in the European Union. There's maybe not a radical rise of Euroscepticism in Poland, but if you look at CBOS surveys, there's definitely this feeling that Poland is not able enough to influence decisions in Brussels. How much time do I have? A few minutes? Okay. So I think there's a kind of European, if Poland is to become a country that has influence in Brussels, it should definitely do some work with its business community. Now, quickly about Polish labor, how it should be strengthened and why it should be strengthened. Law and Justice very much focused on legislative reforms, increasing spending, social spending on family benefits, other issues, also increasing minimum wages. We can discuss whether that was good or bad. I don't want to get into that. But my point would be it's always legislative changes. And legislative changes that have done nothing really actually to strengthen organized labor, i.e. trade unions, despite the fact that PiS has had Solidarność as one of its key allies. Now, I would understand that the new government, and particularly the liberals in the new government, would not now want to do something about increasing the power of trade unions because they would fear that this would just strengthen a partner of PiS, namely Solidarność. Now, there are some parties in the coalition, particularly one party, Nowa Lewica, that has links with another trade union, OPZZ. And if you actually let the union thrive a bit more, you might actually let also Polish social democracy thrive a bit more at the expense, I would say, of Law and Justice, which to some extent is, unfortunately, the Polish version of social democracy. And instead of thinking about how to increase union density, we could at the very least give unions and Polish business the means to talk to each other and to try to regulate the Polish economy. They have some means. There's the so-called Rada Dialogu Społecznego, the Council of Social Dialogue, previously called the Tripartite Body Council. The problem is that the model in which it functions is that it's based on trilateral dialogue. Employers, trade unions, and the state, ministers, the government. What one should normally aim for, the problem is that this allows the government often to divide and rule because it just chooses its preferred partner depending on what the government wants to introduce. The way normally social dialogue in terms of shaping legislation works in Western Europe and Nordic countries is normally via strong bilateral dialogue between employers' associations and trade unions, which normally should come up with a compromise solution between themselves and then go and bring that compromise solution up to the government. Of course, that doesn't always work, and sometimes you end up having also this pattern of trilateral negotiations and divide and rule. Now, more often than not, the business community and trade unions come up with a kind of compromise solution because they are used to finding compromises in a whole area of private governance, of private regulation of labor markets, which is done through the contrat, through the contract, not la loi, the law, through collective agreements. And that doesn't really exist in Poland. There is no collective bargaining in Poland. And collective bargaining is about solving conflicts. It's about just acknowledging that there's a conflict between capital and labor, and then finding compromise solutions to solve the conflicts. And and then I'll finish. Recently, there was a directive on minimum wages that was passed in Brussels by the European Union, that actually one of whose stipulations is that member states that have collective bargaining coverage below 80% should actually try to strengthen collective bargaining by coming up with an action plan. And if you look at Poland and the coverage of collective bargaining, which is below 15%, you can see that there's a lot of work to do. And I think this is a real opportunity for the previous opposition new government, because Solidarność, as a trade union, has always understood that collective bargaining is the most essential power resource of any trade union, but also of any employer association. And Law and Justice has never delivered on that. There were conferences, Solidarność lobbied Law and Justice to do something about collective bargaining, but Law and Justice didn't do anything about it. It actually also was against that directive on minimum wages because it didn't want to have collective bargaining in Poland. So to conclude, if you want to have slightly less polarization, this is not a silver bullet. This will certainly not solve all of Poland's problems, but at least introduce a culture of cooperation, negotiation, and thinking strategically too about the future, plus strengthening Poland's capacity to influence decisions in Brussels. You should strengthen Polish capital and you should strengthen Polish labor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these really thought-provoking and somehow inspiring talks. And I'd like to ask if you'd like to respond to one another. Are there any comments? Anything that you would like to add, perhaps, to what Marek or Matthew and said?
I only say that if we do our proposal and your proposal, then we have basically Austria or Germany, yes? A decentralized corporatist state. Which is not bad, actually. Yes, these are pretty stable democracies, and they are. I live in Austria. I can tell you, it's a very, very, geographically differentiated country. Yes, I mean, Vienna has been choosing. For the few years, it couldn't choose its mayor because of fascism, but otherwise it has always chosen social democrats for 100 years, yes? And if you go to the provinces, they are deeply conservative, in many ways more conservative than the southeast of Poland because they didn't have the experience of communism, yes? And so that shows you that it works. And I think a lot of our members who are deeply conservative in our little organization of decentralizers actually look at Bavaria and conservative Austrian states as an aspirational model. And I think that's good.
So I would like to open the floor for the Q&A. So should we start with you and then followed by Grzegorz and questions?
I would be interested to know what proportion of foreign capital there is in the key industries of countries like Belgium or Ireland. And I suspect quite high, higher than France or Germany, which I think is a feature of economies that started off as peripheral and Poland was very peripheral 40 years ago. And we didn't consciously choose this model of growth, but it was a shortcut to have a lot of foreign capital come in and be an engine of our growth. And there is a price to pay for it, and perhaps we are paying it now. But that's not to say that it wasn't useful. And it's not to say that Polish companies will not go up the value chain in due course, when perhaps the successor generation of the founders of these mostly family companies will want to innovate more. Plus, is it so bad to be Belgium or Ireland? They seem to be doing pretty well.
So let me respond to this. I mean, Belgium as a peripheral country, I would disagree. It was the second first industrializer in Europe after England, and it used to have strong national champions that it actually sold in the early 90s following the same kind of logic when privatization, right, of state-owned companies. And not only, I mean, generally, there was an opening of the internal market. We know that freedom of movement of capital has effects on this.
Belgium wasn't marginal, but it's a model of a completely open economy.
Yes, but you can be open to trade without being too open to free movement of capital, and you can still have poison pills in your companies. I mean, we know that everywhere in Western Europe, except Belgium. Belgium is actually is kind of one of the countries that really opened themselves the most in the 90s, and I think that's a mistake for Belgium. We wouldn't have had Fortis and, I mean, whatever. It sold too much to France, actually, and I'm a Francophile. Now, Ireland is actually if I took the slide there and show it, yes, it's the most open one, but we also know that this has to do partly with it being a tax haven. And, there's some rationale to it, but there are also some social problems now in Dublin, right, with housing that arise from it when you have too many techies working there. And we also see it in Massachusetts a little bit, right? Everything gets expensive. And yes, I'm not the type of guy who says, let's reject Balcerowicz, right? And I'm not thinking about the past. I'm thinking about the future. And we've got now some institutions that have been partly introduced by the Tusk government, Polskie Inwestycje Rozwojowe, that were turned into the Polish Development Fund. And I would say just keep them, strengthen them to help Polish business thrive and gradually reduce the gap with Western Europe. But more importantly, reorganize, force Polish business to just get a little bit better organized so that it has some influence in Brussels.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this really inspiring set of ideas. I have two questions which sort of in different ways, were present in previous panel and in this panel. So, we are at the kind of moment in which Poland can move in many different directions, right? That election opened that opportunity. Now the question is this a good time for a deep reforms of any kind, right? Either political, constitutional, or economic reforms, or after this sort of very unpleasant 8 years, we should follow Karolina's argument and say, let's stick to what we have and try to restore sanity and rule of law on the basis of institutions and norms we have, right? So that's the first question, and I wonder what you think about this. Is this the right moment to really jump and have the second huge transition, or just really be very sort of moderate and conservative in many ways? Now the second question is about concrete ways of finding solutions to the problem Marek outlined, because I think problems are real and they are true, but the peace solution was to dramatically increase the state ownership in various sectors of the economy, sort of create champions in a way, you know, let's put the 25 banks together, takes the bank from private owners like Czarnecki and put it under the umbrella of some big state institutions. And this was the idea for many other sectors of the economy. And I think here is the real disagreement which the new government can easily argue for. That what you need to do is to strengthen Czarnecki, so he has really very powerful bank which can compete with the state-owned banks and with the foreign-owned banks. So instead of nationalizing and creating champions from above, really supporting entrepreneurship in Poland and you know the business elites of Poland and so on. And as far as I can sense, that's exactly what Tusk is having in mind, right? A set of proposals to deregulate certain things and so on, just opening the space for private business. So that's my two questions.
Maybe I will start. I think the answer depends on what you can get from the actors. I believe that if there is any opportunity to get to the new social contract, I think this is by far the best option for Poland. And it assumes that you can convince part of the conservative side to get to the, let's say, new round table. This is how we frame it. And I think this is the best option for now. What is the disadvantage of staying on the conservative, in the conservative strategy which Karolina mentioned? I think you are postponing problems. You're postponing deep political problems for Poland, because the conservative side, and we can see that after their defeat, it's not changing. It's not that they now started to recognize constitution. They are repeating the same interpretation of the constitution. And as political scientists, we all know, constitution and institutions, these are things which work in practice. It's not what is written on a paper. And the problem is that we have an actor which claims that something different is written on the paper than the rest of the system. And if you wait 4 years, it's not going to get better. So I think that we really should think strategically how this political force could be incentivized, could be convinced to agree on some kind of compromise. It could be the thing we offer, it could be something different, but you must get them to the table. Otherwise, every next Polish elections will be elections about the democracy, about the system, about the regime. And I think this will be, for a long term, a very destabilizing factor for the country.
I would also mention that we have a tradition in the last 30 years of very successful decentralization reforms that were not disruptive at all to the system, to the, they are viewed as one of the most successful reforms. The first wave in 1990, the second in 1998. Why can we even talk about the provinces? Because the 1998 reform, which was initiated by the right, which is again a signal that this local governance, it's not only the letter of the Catholic social doctrine and subsidiarity, but it's practice that actually both decentralization reforms were introduced by either center-right in the 1990s and, pretty conservative right in 1998. The fact that we are even talking about the Senate of the governors is because these governors were created in 1998, given very little power. So one thing you can one way to see our proposal is a logical conclusion of the process that has already started, that has been wildly popular in Poland. Actually, if you look at the measures of social trust, local governments beat national institutions by a huge margin, yes? So this is not some disruptive, exotic idea. This is deeply rooted in what has worked in the Third Republic, and it's simply bringing it to a logical conclusion.
We have, sorry, you had a question?
I have it's a different thread, so perhaps it would make sense to continue that thread, and I'll jump in
Would you like
with
to
my
continue
question.
on that one? Because also Carolina had a
Well,
question.
I'd like us to be clear about what has happened to the Polish capital in Poland in recent years, because it's not true that they somehow worked to strengthen it. Look at the petrochemical giant Orlen. Under the ideology of making it more Polish, making it bigger, they took over the second largest petrochemical company. Part of it they sold to the Saudis, never mind. The point is that this is a uniquely Polish, weird model of capitalism. Because actually the 2/3 of the capital is private of Orlen. But the state controls it by controlling 30%. And it's been and state control, which is to say party control, sending party placement there, is a kind of doomsday machine for destroying value. Orlen is now worth half of what it was worth 8 years ago. But it was useful, wasn't it, in buying up the private media and in engineering a drop in the price of petrol in the election campaign. That was its main purpose, not somehow making Poland less dependent on capital. Purely political. I'm fundamentally skeptical about whether Polish bureaucracy can produce the kinds of strategic managers that can run well an organization of this size. You know, if we were, then socialism would have worked, and it didn't.
You don't need socialism. We agree. We agree on what PiS has done, and I criticize PiS for increasing dependence on foreign capital. We should do something about the banking sector. If there was that decentralization, there's a specific technical idea that you have in your book, which would be to give ownership of maybe the two largest Polish state-controlled banks, PKO SA and PKO BP, to some of the voivodeships. I think that's a bad idea, because I think they should be based in Warsaw with some kind of Warsaw-based shareholders, because it's also about building Warsaw as a financial center, and you have to have strong banks in your financial center for that center to have some to be meaningful. Now, if you decentralize power, you could, right? You have these ideas of giving ownership of companies to different voivodeships. You can use dispersed share ownership. You could give 2% to each of the voivodeships, giving them, right, maybe those 30% of right, the 30% control. The share which gives you control, and they would actually have to negotiate with each other, and right, the appointment of CEOs would be directly much less political. That's one thing. Second thing, and I'm very Frenchy here, right? You don't have to be a socialist to be Napoleonic and kind of Bourbon type, right? Where does the strength of the French state come from? Also from the French form of internal state corporatism, which also leads to problems. But everybody has been thinking about ENA. But let's forget about ENA for a second. The power of the Parisian bourgeoisie comes from École Polytechnique and the Corps Technique de l'État. You have the Corps des Mines, the core of the mines people, and the Corps des Ponts et Chaussées, which, by the way, has been reproduced in America too, by the army and by the Dutch with the Rijkswaterschap, which has been building the infrastructure of the Netherlands. But the whole French infrastructure has been built by an elite corps of civil servants who are unremovable, and these people have also become managers of French national champions. And as far as I can see, BNP Paribas is not doing badly, even though everybody knows it's state-controlled. And I think, right, you have the second mover advantage. You can learn from the lessons, right? You don't want to give too much power to some elite civil servants that you could create who are technicians and not just generalists. But you could at least create some pockets of excellence within the Polish state apparatus by giving some power to technicians and creating a Polish technocracy that every other West European country has under a different form. So.
Just one clarification. In the book, we actually propose to move to regional governments, not 2, but 345 state-owned companies. And the analysis, there was a very thorough analysis how to do it, how to apportion it fairly. You would never guess who wrote the analysis, who authored this analysis. It's the CEO of Forum Obywatelskiego Rozwoju, which is Leszek Balcerowicz's think tank. Yes, he is one of our 28 co-authors, and he is totally seeing that, of course, he is with Minister Sikorski in his heart, but he understands there is this other side that doesn't want to do it. So he says maybe the compromise is to regionalize it, and then the progressive voivodeships will privatize, and the conservatives maybe will learn from it, or maybe not. But that is the spirit of what we are talking about, finding some compromise in the middle, rather than assuming that the other point of view will simply disappear.
A question from Carolina? And
Yes,
and then-
because it's the same thread.
Okay, go ahead.
So first point I would like to make, to explain the difference I see between the eyes of a political scientist and the eyes of sociologists. So for my sociological eyes, those colorful maps of Poland that you have shown are just colorful maps. These are only colors. Why? Because it's not that 90% of people vote for the right-wing option and 10% of people vote for another option. It's very often 50-50. It's very often 51 to 49, for example, when you look at the presidential elections, for example. So I would be very cautious in jumping to conclusions as for how those regions, those voivodeships, should actually look like and how they would eventually vote. This is very important methodology remark, I believe. So this is point number one. Point number two, I would like to come back to the flaws of revolution. I formed, as a liberal, perhaps bizarre, but I formed a conservative argument, but I would like to clarify this argument. I don't like the argument which goes, it's not the time to, because it's extremely paternalistic. And this is not an argument that I'm making. I'm making another argument. My argument is thus. As Poles and as Polish political culture, we have experienced a lot of discontinuity. So much discontinuity that we perhaps started to believe that another discontinuity is the solution for our problems. This is exactly what Jarosław Kaczyński was aiming at when he said in 2015 that what he would like is another revolution of 1989. For many people it sounded convincing. For me, personally, it sounded disastrous, because another discontinuity is actually spoiling the effect of a long evolution of institutions and habits, which is the most essential part in democracy. Now, we know this not only from studying political cultures. We actually know this also from brain science. But change happens most effectively when we only change small habits instead of changing the whole of it. So I would like to push you a little bit, Anna and Maciej, and ask you to please elaborate and defend against those arguments your vision of another discontinuity, in fact. When the change, I would argue, should be evolutionary. To Marek, I have a question too. I was wondering when you were speaking, if the sole strengthening of Polish business would be enough to make it more interested in funding civil society. Because when you look at the civil society and how it's being funded in Poland, you will see a bizarre thing. It depends on which civil society. So the right-wing businessman, very often very loyal to peace, will be very eager to help their civil society. But the liberals are not so eager. And so the choice of going to the West and becoming the German agent this is a longer habit than those 8 years. I think it is serious, and I wonder what is going to happen after the new government is being formed. I agree with you completely that in the interest of the state, it is financing robust, pluralistic civil society. But how to do it with this challenge that I have mentioned?
Okay, so you mentioned that we, in our maps, showed how those regions will vote. We never actually said anything about how they will behave. This was only an analysis how they behaved in the past. And Maciej, I think, clearly signaled that in a system in which there will not be a situation of winner takes all, you could see much more diversity and shades of those different colors. And even in the book, because we have a very strong conviction that it's not going to be two types of voivodeships. That's why we invited famous writers, and those ideas of how regions could look like are fictions. This is just an invitation to think how we could organize differently our country and what things would become possible in such a system, which are not possible now. And starting from here, you said that it's a revolution. Actually, for us, what is critical is the change of the level on which the decisions are taken on the matters which concern the everyday lives of the citizens. And we don't want to decide who would change things in what direction. Actually, on the days one of the reform, everything stays as it is. And every change needs to be initiated by the regions. So actually, it's very possible that a lot of things would stay as they are, but the difference would be that local communities would have much more agency and much more power to decide what they want. And perhaps if they can make those decisions, if they could decide differently than the center, then they would not necessarily be so much motivated to I don't know, change curricula, for example, at school, right? So the idea of this book is not that we say, okay, in this voivodeship it will be, the education will be progressive, and on the other it will be conservative. It could happen. The idea is, but for us the idea is that you give those regions the powers to decide, and on day one, everything stays as it is, and they have to decide and initiate the process.
Before I address your point on civil society, which is a very good point, just on the issue of revolution, stalemate, or evolution, I mean, I very much hope that there will be a new roundtable one day. Very much hope so. I mean, I would probably not decentralize to the extent that you would want to, but I kind of keep my fingers crossed for your project. But just to say, collective bargaining doesn't require the introduction of collective bargaining, and the strengthening of corporatism effectively in Poland doesn't require any constitutional changes. It's about applying Article 20 of the current Polish constitution, which states that Poland is a social market economy, soziale Marktwirtschaft, which has strong social dialogue. And it's about applying Article 59, paragraph 2, which states that trade unions and employers organizations have a right to conduct collective bargaining. There is no collective bargaining, certainly not at sectoral or national level in Poland. On civil society, you're absolutely right. We also see that issue of business supporting illiberal, right, civil society in America, right, with the Koch brothers. So certainly it's an issue, and I don't have an easy solution around that. But apologies for, again, sounding extremely Frenchy. The Frenchy solution to some of those problems, right, strengthening the Parisian bourgeoisie, which used to be very weak, actually, in the 19th century. France always felt it's behind Germany and the UK and Belgium in terms of economic development. In terms of strengthening the bourgeoisie and strengthening the state apparatus has been to create elite schools. And if you look right at when the École Polytechnique was created, straight after, during the French Revolution, and then strengthened by Napoleon. If you look at when Sciences Po was created, it's when Paris was taken over by the Prussians in 1871. That's when Sciences Po was created to actually strengthen the French state apparatus and democratic values among the Parisian bourgeoisie. And when that system failed during the Vichy regime, that's when Sciences Po, which used to be a private foundation, was taken over by the Gaullist state, and that's also when the ENA was created in 1945 to reshape those institutions so that they further democratic values. So I think that by thinking about higher education, elite higher education in Poland with well-embedded democratic values in it, you would shape also leaders with democratic values in Poland for the future, both for the state apparatus and business and the union movement.
I just want to clarify, because you mentioned that you don't want to decentralize to the extent, and I think there is still a misunderstanding of our proposal. Using Bruce Ackerman's concept of dual politics, what we are proposing is a constitutional level. So how we decide about how we decide, yes, not policy level. We are not saying that these policies must be decentralized. We are saying let's create a powerful lobby of subnational governments in the form of the new Senate and a powerful lobby of the municipalities and cities in the form of voivodeship Senate that will decide what will be decentralized. Yes, it's the third way that Anna mentioned. We don't want to, determine that education will be different. If Carolina is right, then everything stays the same, but power will be closer to the people. There will be accountability benefits, so there is a net plus, but there will be this third option from the total victor and total defeat. And the poisonous nature of the current system is that there is no third option. If you are a conservative, and this was such an educational process for me working with those peace supporters over the 6 years, they are as terrified of us as we are of them. They really are. They say, you have Europe, you will have, the moment you have central government and Europe and everything and foreign capital, you will crush us. That's their outlook. Correct or not, different story. But maybe it's good if both sides are terrified, because maybe we can have a deal.
Okay, there's one more question and then Martin.
So now for something completely different. I happen to have a particular weakness for historical maps and spent way too much time playing with those. And I couldn't help but notice the extent to which your political polarization maps of Poland resemble the post-1815, assorted post-1815 maps of Central Europe, in particular the partition boundaries. Of course, it's worth noting that people who live in the northwest, southwest, and west of Poland are mostly descendants of those who ended up there in 1945 or later as a result of massive population transfers, shall we say, or settlements, if you will, of those who happen to live in the former eastern borderlands of Poland. So any insights or comments on that? As I said, superficial observation, probably accidental, but any insights you may have, I would welcome.
yesterday during the dinner we had this conversation, including with Professor Markowski, and we said that if not the World War II and Polish borders were not moved to the west, the Polish liberals would never win. So yes, this is so I think you are right. I think there is definitely something into it. Yeah, I think we don't have time to get into the details. Mm-hmm.
So I would like to collect the questions, Professor Markowski and then Martin.
This is very briefly because I sense it's the end of the session. First of all, I mean, when listening to you and what you propose, I mean, isn't it because I can draw these maps. Now you're simply pushing the problem from the central area into voivodeships. I can show you how particular voivodeship is equally divided among conservatives, liberals, and socialists. And then you have the same kind of conflict within a voivodeship as you have on the national level. Isn't it a problem? That's one. Secondly, I mean, this is a long story, but let me make it short. I don't buy to this calls in Poland, let's unite again. In my lifetime, I still think that my life expectancy is about 20, but I don't think we'll be a united society as such. But the wisdom of political men was that if you don't agree on substance and policies, you invent procedure that you agree on. There's a procedural outcome. Holland, for 70 years, was living in 3 pillars. Elite on the top was agreeing between themselves, and Catholics were living there. Catholic life, Protestants were living there. Protestant and seculars were there. You don't have to be together. You have to institutionalize the differences and conflicts and not forcefully unite into, this. I know politicians have to say, let's unite.
But this is what we propose. The problem is that Polish elites do not agree on the procedures.
Yeah,
we are on the same side.
But then I strongly, and moving to Marek, just one remark. I want strongly to second what Radek Sikorski said, that these ideas, most of them, are fantastic, but you need a decent bureaucracy, which is missing in Poland. I mean, that's the main thing. You cannot do all these beautiful things with the kind of bureaucracy we have at this point. And of course, it's a vicious circle. And finally, when I was, of course, due to time shortages, but when I was listening to you, I had this impression that you are saying basically there is too little of Polish capital, too little of Polish capitalism. At the same time, your recipes were spiritually Western.
Yes.
You want more Western thought into these eastern provinces of Europe. So isn't it a discrepancy a bit?
We just collect maybe Martin and then.
Yeah, well, I totally understand your thrive for decentralization and for sub-governmental institutions. But when you look at the United States, for example, you have all those institutions. You have the Governors Association, you have the Mayor Association, you have city-to-city engagements, and it still did not prevent Donald Trump. And it may have survived him at least once, but you have very parallel constructions here. So sometimes you think you're in 2 different countries when you go down to the cities, and if you look at Washington, the cities you have corporations, in Washington it doesn't work. So building new institutions is not any guarantee, against another fundamental attack. So my question would be, going back to what Karolina said, if those incremental steps would not be more helpful. And what I was a bit missing on my question is, what would you do to actually make the existing institutions more immune against what has happened in the past 10 years so that they can resist another attack?
Quick replies.
Yes, so the maps that we show underestimate the level of ideological differences, geographic, and the maps you mentioned within voivodeship overestimate. Why? Because of the behavior of the political parties. So Donald Tusk's parties choose conservative candidates in southeast Poland, and PiS chooses more moderate candidates generally in northwest. That's why the differences are actually deeper, because some people of conservative persuasion would still vote for the conservative platform candidates. The intra-voivodeship maps overestimated for the same reason, that parties choose, for example, the two mayor of Lublin from the civic platform from Donald Tusk's party once was not okay with the LGBT march in Lublin, yes, because he's a very conservative mayor of Lublin. So actually, yes, there is a difference between the city in the south and the countryside in the southeast, which is why we want the voivodeship senate to protect the city. But still, there is a very powerful dimension that is regional. Now, on your argument about the United States, there is this fantastic book by Jacob Grunbach, yes, that on my reading of it shows that the biggest reason is the decentralization of electoral laws and the gerrymandering in the states that you have, which create this political, actually make the political polarization worse. So yes, as Elinor Ostrom said, we need to have details matter with institutions. Yes, so the fact that we don't want a federal state, we want to decentralize policies but not electoral laws, will have a significantly different outcome. Yes, so if you want a comparison, it's dangerous to say, but a better comparison is Germany or Austria than the United States for what we are proposing, especially Austria, because it's a fake federation, it's a very weak federation. We say our proposal is for a deeply decentralized unitary state because of the unitary judiciary, law enforcement, and electoral laws. But now, frankly, looking comparatively, it's a silly debate, federalism versus unitary. There are so many varieties of decentralization that happens that you should assess this proposal on its merit, not assign any labels to it.
To Professor Markowski's 2 points. First, yes, we agree, we need a strong Polish state. That was the third leg that I couldn't develop in my presentation, hence my coming up with those very French ideas of elite civil servants and not just generalists in that type, but also technicians from the Warsaw Polytechnic and maybe some state polytechnic that embeds democratic values in them. About there being a paradox in what I've been saying, being more nationalist and at the same time Western European, pro-European, there's no discrepancy in it. The Western European countries never gave up control of capital. And this is precisely what I tried to show with banking. And when they've been, right, I mean, I've been doing a lot of interviews with these actors, right, promoting repolonization or opposing repolonization in Poland. And I tried to do an interview with an influential MEP from the Civic Platform, who has been known for thinking strategically about the future of Poland, and I very much respect him for that. But he refused to do an interview with me because he was very much opposed to this stupid idea of economic patriotism. And in the email, what that person replied was, I've been thinking of Europe, I would prefer to have European champions than national champions. And yes, I would also, I want a sovereign state, a sovereign European state tomorrow. I was born and raised in Brussels. The EU is in my blood. But you just look at attempts to create European national champions. You always have the problem of who controls capitalistically those companies and where the headquarters is based. Look at Airbus. And so that's why, it would make sense if Poland wants to be a core member of the European Union and not a peripheral one, Warsaw and other big Polish cities should have some headquarters of big Polish national champions that could then invest abroad. Let's bring Warsaw into Budapest and not Budapest into Warsaw.
Yeah, we've had a large Polish company invest abroad. KGHM invested in Chile. Complete disaster.
Maybe because it's two-state control.
Rather Eurostate.
On that note, panelists, and let's just have a round of applause.